Some royal mistresses were kind, some became queens, and some were conniving and manipulative. This mistress definitely fell into the last category, Catherine Henriette de Balsac d'Entragues. She would become a mistress to a powerful king of France, Henri IV, but despite her best attempts, would never quite manage to become queen. Born in 1579, Catherine was part of a noble French family that was deeply entwined with the royal family, but in a very intimate way. Her parents were François de Balsac, Seigneur d'Entragues, a prominent noble and courtier, and Marie Touchet, a woman who had come originally from a wealthy merchant family, but had been a mistress of Charles IX of France before her marriage. Although Francois's two brothers were both favourites of the king, he was not, and would actually later join the faction against the king during the religious wars. Her parents had another daughter, her sister, Marie-Charlotte, and her father's first marriage had also produced two sons and a daughter, some of Catherine's half-siblings. Very little is known about Catherine's childhood, but it's likely it would have been one filled with whispers of intrigue from court, as well as stories about her mother. It's known that her mother didn't hide the fact she had been a mistress to the previous King of France. This was partially since she did have an illegitimate son with him, Charles de Valois, and this meant Marie remained a part of the intimate royal circle at the French court. Charles was therefore also a half-sibling of Catherine, and so it's probable that she spent time at court learning how to behave as a courtier. Her father had enjoyed some favour with Charles IX during the late 1560s and early 1570s, and this continued into the reign of Henri III. However, he had been somewhat pressured to marry Marie, as due to her position as mother to an illegitimate son of the previous king, a safe pair of hands was needed to keep her from getting any ideas about the French throne. Francois was deemed to be this pair of hands. In 1582, when Catherine was 3 years old, her father was made conseiller d'État, a position that gave him a leading role in state policy. But 2 years later, in June 1584, Francois, Duke of Anjou, died at the young age of 29. As his older brother, Henri III, now had no direct living heir, the next senior agnatic descendant of King Louis IX was Henri of Navarre, remembering that France's silly Salic law prevented the king's sisters from taking the throne. This would have been fine, except Henri of Navarre was a Protestant at a time when most of France was Catholic. By March 1585, François de Balsac had aligned himself with the Catholic League, a group of nobles determined to stop a Protestant monarch reaching the throne of France, and seemingly content to kill as many people as needed to get to that point. The French wars of religion had been bubbling on and off since 1562, and yet again, conflict kicked off. Orléans became a part of the Catholic League's safe spaces, as Francois was Lieutenant General of the city. On the 21st of April, the city was attacked by royalist forces led by the Duc de Montpensier, which Francois met with cannon fire, repelling them from the citadel. As the League's army grew, it forced Henri's hand, and eventually he had to negotiate with the nobles involved. He had to outlaw Protestantism, and also declare he would go to war with his now former heir, Henri of Navarre. By May 1586, Francois's brother had come to speak with him on behalf of the king, and Francois conceded Orléans and rejoined the royalists, writing to the king and ensuring him he would never again be part of a league against royal authority. However, Francois would remain somewhat under suspicion over the years, even though he did not publicly rise against Henri III ever again. By now, Catherine would have been around 7 years old and likely had begun her education as a young noble lady. She would have been taught practical courtly skills such as dancing and music alongside household management, running an estate, and sewing and weaving. But at the time, young French noblewomen were also usually taught reading, writing, and philosophy. Politics would almost certainly have been something Catherine learned, much of this probably coming from growing to understand her father's position and her mother's. Her family's closeness to their Catholic faith would also no doubt have coloured much of her belief system. But it's also possible that her mother Marie taught her daughters a few things about flirting and catching the attention of royal men, as both would grow up to become the mistress of one. A few years later, in 1589, Henri III was assassinated by a monk on the 2nd of August, while he was camped out near Paris during yet another conflict, the War of the Three Henrys. By this point, however, he had reconciled with his kinsman, Henri of Navarre, and the two men had paired up with their forces to win France back from the Catholic League, which this time Catherine's father wasn't involved in. Henri of Navarre now became King of France as Henri IV, but it would be a couple more years before he truly got control of France, eventually having to agree to become Catholic in order to regain Paris in 1593, under the guidance of his mistress, Gabrielle d'Estrées. Catherine was now a 14-year-old, old enough in the 16th century to be considered for marriage, and it's highly likely that she now accompanied her mother to court in order to catch someone's eye. It was here she was likely to have made the acquaintance of Henri IV and must have made a good impression. Few descriptions go into details of Catherine's appearance, but she is described as pretty, and her surviving portraits show her to be a woman with blonde hair, light blue or grey eyes, and fashionably dressed. Sometime in her late teens she became, as her mother had, mistress to the King of France. By all accounts, Henri was very taken with her, but she wouldn't occupy the main place in his heart just yet. Gabrielle d'Estrées was Henri's official royal mistress, or maîtresse en titre, but he was still technically married to Margaret of Valois. Their marriage had been an unhappy one, and before he even became king, they had separated, and Henri and Gabrielle were openly affectionate with one another in public. When the marriage to Margaret was annulled in 1599, Henri asked the Pope for authority to remarry, and assumed he would be able to marry Gabrielle as his next wife and queen. She was pregnant with their 4th child, and in March he gave her his coronation ring as a symbol of his promise to marry her. Many of his courtiers were not happy about the proposal, but fate intervened anyway, and on the 9th of April, poor Gabrielle suffered eclampsia and gave birth to a stillborn son. Henri was on his way to her in Paris when he learned she had died the following day, on the 10th of April. Catherine saw this as her moment to strike. By this point, she had been a mistress of the king for a few years, but obviously he was taken with Gabrielle. With her out of the picture and Henri now free to marry, Catherine saw no reason it couldn't be her. After all, other mistresses had famously coerced a king into making them queen. While he was still deep in mourning, Catherine was moved up to be his new maîtresse en titre, a position which allowed her exclusive access to the king's ear, but she also managed to convince him to make a written agreement stating he would marry her. Fair enough, except that in March 1600, it was revealed that Henri had signed a marriage contract between himself and Maria de Medici, a member of the powerful Medici family, though her father as Grand Duke of Tuscany. The marriage was purely economical. France was financially crippled by the last few decades of war, and Henri owed money everywhere, including to the father of his new bride, Francesco I de' Medici, Grand Duke of Tuscany. In return for making his daughter the Queen of France, Francesco agreed to give 600,000 écus, or around 3 million livres, in order to cancel out Henri's debt and turn his debt into a bank ledger. The French king might have been besotted with Catherine, but she had no lands or money to bring to the table. On the 17th of December that year, Henri married Maria officially in the Cathedral of Saint Jean-Baptiste de Lyon, and Maria took on her French name of Marie. Catherine was furious when she found out the agreement between herself and Henri had been broken, and she took it out on poor Marie. She nicknamed the new queen La Grosse Banquière, or the Big Banker, or perhaps even the Fat Banker, indicating she had only been chosen for the cash her father gave and nothing more. It would become an uncomfortable dynamic. Marie was very jealous, understandably, at the attention her new husband gave his mistresses. She and Catherine would publicly argue in court, Marie apparently using language that shocked those present, and to make this worse, the king always took the side of Catherine, not Marie. To counteract this, Marie showed great sympathy and warmth towards the king's first wife, Margaret of Valois, Henri finally relenting and allowing Margaret to return to Paris. Catherine fell pregnant with her first child in the following year, a son born on the 3rd of November 1601 called Gaston Henri. 2 years later, she would then give birth to a daughter named Gabrielle Angélique, born in 1603. Both children were legitimized in the same year. But just before this in 1602, Catherine would be involved in a revolt. Charles du Gontaut, the Duc de Biron, and Catherine's half-brother Charles de Valois, Comte de Auvergne, were part of a plot with Spain to go to war with France and overthrow Henri IV, along with a host of other nobles still grinding their teeth over the fact their king wasn't a proper Catholic. And you might think this would compromise Catherine's position, except actually it saved her brother. Using her influence over the king, she managed to get him to forgive Charles and release him, despite the Duc de Biron being executed for his part in the plot. But in 1604 there would be yet another conspiracy against the king. Charles, Catherine and her father Francois were all implicated in talks with Philip III of Spain again. Francois's properties were searched and papers were found confirming the fact all three were involved. In December, Francois and Charles were condemned to death, and Catherine was sentenced to spend the rest of her life in a convent. It probably won't surprise you to hear that wasn't actually what happened at all. Both Catherine and her father pleaded only that they were sore about Henri IV going back on his promise of marriage, and Francois said he simply wanted the best for his daughter. She must have worked her charms once again on the king, as the death sentence for both men was commuted to mere imprisonment. The Bastille for Charles and house arrest for Francois. Charles was supposed to spend the rest of his life in the Bastille, but in fact he would be there only until 1616. As for Catherine, she didn't even step foot in a convent, and instead was allowed to simply retire to her estate at Verneuil-sur-Avray. By 1608, Henri had once again taken her as a mistress. But it couldn't last forever. Marie de Medici hadn't yet been crowned, but it would finally happen on the 13th of May 1610. Henri hadn't yet allowed his queen to be crowned, but he was temporarily going to leave the country to take part in the War of the Julic Succession. His parlement and the king himself were anxious there should be a regal and adult hand to be regent if the worst should happen, as his son, the Dauphin Louis, was still only a child of 9 years old. Henri basically wanted Marie to be able to wield a bit more clout politically for him while he was gone, but it would prove to be a grave error. The very next day, on the 14th, while Henri was on his way in his carriage, it was stopped on Rue de la Ferronnerie. A Catholic zealot, by the name of Francois Ravaillac stabbed the king and killed him. Henri had survived 11 other assassination attempts, but not this one. Ravaillac was grabbed and executed, but the real plotters behind the murder were not found. Equal suspicion fell on Marie, as the timing was incredibly suspicious considering she had been crowned as queen just the day before, and she was part of the powerful Medici family who had probably had to listen to her complaints about her useless husband for the last decade. But suspicion also fell on Catherine and her father Francois, but there wasn't any evidence either way. And so Queen Marie became regent for her young son, wasting no time in taking charge. Unsurprisingly, one of her first acts was to banish Catherine from court, and the king's mistress disappeared into one of her properties, never to darken the doors of the French court again, dying over 20 years later in 1633. Catherine had certainly tried her best to become Queen of France. She was a young woman who had been groomed, seemingly not for the best marriage she could get, but to be the best mistress possible. As a teen, succeeding in her plan to seduce the French king came against the background of her father's political intrigues. But despite this, whether through her looks or charms, Catherine managed to wrap Henri somewhat around her little finger, whether to release her loved ones or herself from prison, or to extract a written agreement for marriage, which never happened. In this one important point, she would be unsuccessful, instead having an intense and jealous rivalry for Henri's affections with his new wife Marie de Medici. Once the king was dead, her days at court were over. Catherine was a royal mistress who aimed for the highest position possible, but unlike some of the other mistresses in this series, she never managed it. Catherine could be a mother, a beautiful mistress, an influence in the king's ear. But Henri's financial problems ensured she would never be queen. Whereas some mistresses hid a heart of gold, it's obvious Catherine hid a heart of ice, and was prepared to do whatever she could to gain what she wanted, even if it wasn't possible. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss any new documentaries.